For months, she tried to explain the itching in the simplest way possible. First, she blamed the weather. Then the soap. After that, the fabric of her clothes, the fabric softener, stress, her diet, anything that felt easier to accept than the idea that something might actually be wrong. There was no dramatic wound. No frightening rash suddenly appearing out of nowhere. No blood, no severe pain, no alarming sign that would force someone to run to the hospital. There was just itching. But it was always there. During the day, it bothered her. At night, it took over. And when the house grew quiet, when everything around her slowed down, that discomfort seemed to expand until it filled her entire body. At first, the solutions felt logical. Cold showers. Moisturizing creams. Ointments bought on recommendation. Changing the detergent. Changing the sheets. Antihistamines. More cream. Then another cream. Nothing truly solved it. At best, something would seem to help for a day or two, and then it all came back. Stronger. More exhausting. Stranger. Because one thing was certain, this had gone far beyond the point of being just a minor annoyance. The itching was not confined to a single spot. It was not an obvious bite. It was not one isolated patch of skin asking for attention. It was a widespread, persistent sensation, hard to describe and impossible to ignore. And there was something even more disturbing about all of it. Sometimes, when she looked at her own skin, she saw nothing that could justify the scale of the torment. That is exactly where this kind of story starts becoming dangerous. Because when a symptom seems too simple, people tend to underestimate it for too long. And itching is one of the most deceptive symptoms in that sense. Most people hear the word and immediately think of allergy, dryness, dermatitis, an insect bite, sensitivity to some product. And yes, many times the cause really is in the skin. But not always. Sometimes the skin is not the source of the problem. Sometimes it is only the messenger. What looks like a common dermatologic issue can, in some cases, be the reflection of something systemic, something that started deeper and chose the skin as the place where it would show itself. That is why professionals do not look only at the itch itself. They look at the context. The duration. The symptoms that came with it. What makes it worse? What accompanies it? The detail the patient almost always mentions as if it were secondary, without realizing it may be the main clue. When itching is intense, generalized, and lasts for weeks or months without an obvious explanation, clinical reasoning has to widen. And that is the central point of this case. Because the question stops being, which cream works for this, and becomes, why is this body itching like this? In medicine, very common symptoms sometimes hide very different diagnoses. The same itch can point to an inflammatory skin condition. It can suggest an infestation like scabies. It can raise suspicion about the liver, the bile ducts, the kidneys, the blood, or other internal disturbances. The symptom is the same. The mechanism behind it may be completely different. What made this case even more intriguing was the fact that it got worse at night. During the day, there were still distractions. Appointments. Conversations. Movement. But when night came, it was as if the itching took control. Sleeping became difficult. Rest turned into a challenge. And instead of helping explain the problem, that only made it more confusing. Because nighttime worsening can appear in different situations, but there is one possibility in particular that calls attention precisely because of that pattern: scabies. When itching becomes more intense at night and there is even the slightest suspicion that other people in the house may also have symptoms, the case changes direction completely. The problem is no longer only individual. The environment becomes part of the investigation. But there was another detail that made everything even murkier: the absence of a dramatic skin lesion. There was no large, red, scaly plaque, No obvious eruption visible at first glance that would allow someone to point to the skin and confidently say, "There is the cause." That matters a lot. Because generalized itching without an evident lesion does not fit neatly with that simplistic idea of, "It's just skin irritation." When the body itches intensely and the skin does not explain everything on its own, doctors begin to think about causes that come from inside. And one of the most important pathways in that scenario is the liver and the bile ducts. In some cholestatic conditions, for example, substances related to impaired bile flow are associated with significant pruritus, and the itching may appear before more obvious signs become visible. In other cases, the clue comes from the kidneys, especially when there is chronic kidney disease and pruritus becomes part of a larger, quieter, more draining picture. The problem is that the body rarely gives away the full answer all at once. It works in fragments. In subtle signs. In small changes that, taken alone, seem unimportant. And that is exactly what happened here. For a long time, everything seemed to fit inside the most comfortable explanation: allergy, dry skin, irritation. Until one night, in front of the mirror, a strange detail appeared. Something that did not hurt. Something that did not look dramatic. But something that, once seen, could no longer be ignored. That night, standing in front of the mirror, the detail looked too small to change everything. But it did. It was not a new rash. Not an open wound. Nothing loud. It was exactly the kind of change a person tries to deny in the first few seconds, because accepting what they are seeing would mean admitting that the story may never have been about dry skin at all. The whites of her eyes looked different. Slightly different. A tone that did not draw attention from a distance, but up close no longer seemed the same as always. And once that detail appeared, other things began to make sense in sequence, like scattered pieces finally starting to fit together. Her urine had looked darker for days. Her stools, at times, seemed lighter. The fatigue had been there too, but it had been filed under routine stress. And the itching, that relentless itching, was still there, as if it had been trying all along to draw attention to something her body already knew but her mind still did not want to accept. This is the point where a case like this stops being a simple dermatologic complaint and starts requiring a different kind of reasoning. Because when intense itching appears together with yellowish eyes, darker urine, or paler stools, doctors begin looking much more closely at the liver, bile, and biliary pathways. That does not mean every person with itching has liver disease. It only means that when those signs travel together, the hypothesis of, "It's just an allergy," becomes too weak to hold the story up. And what makes this even more unsettling is the fact that the itching can arrive before any obvious visual explanation. In some cholestatic conditions, for example, the discomfort appears as a dominant and deeply exhausting symptom, while the skin still offers no dramatic lesion that makes the picture easy to read. That is deceptive. It deceives the patient, who expects to see something that justifies the suffering. And sometimes it even deceives the people around them, who look at the outside, see no shocking eruption, and minimize what is happening. But generalized pruritus without an obvious skin lesion is a known clinical warning sign. The absence of a major skin finding does not automatically reassure anyone. Sometimes it forces the reasoning to go deeper. But this was not the only path left open. Because one detail kept pulling the story in another direction, the nighttime worsening. Night had become the enemy. While the rest of the house wanted to sleep, her body seemed to wake up just to itch. And in medicine, timing is a clue. Itching that becomes markedly worse at night brings scabies to mind, especially when the itching is intense, widespread, and, most importantly, when someone in the same household begins to report similar symptoms. That is what makes the picture so deceptive. A person can spend weeks treating an infestation as if it were a simple allergy quietly passing from one body to another inside the same home. And then comes a decisive question: was anyone else itching too? Maybe not with the same intensity. Maybe not with the same urgency. Maybe someone in the house had complained here and there about itching, about poor sleep, about irritation on the wrists, between the fingers, around the waist, without thinking much of it. Sometimes that kind of detail is what changes the entire investigation. Because when a symptom that seems individual starts appearing in close contacts, the body is no longer telling an isolated story and the environment enters the script. That is why, in scabies, the household context matters as much as the skin itself. It is not only about what is visible on the patient, but about the pattern of transmission, the close contact, the repetition of the symptom in those who share the bed, the couch, the towels, the routine, the hugs. Suddenly, the mystery no longer lives only in the body. It also lives inside the house. But there was still a third possibility circling the story, more silent, less intuitive for most people, and still very real: the kidneys. This matters because it breaks one of the most common expectations among the general public, the idea that every internal disease must announce itself early with a classic symptom or obvious pain. Not always. Sometimes the body warns through fatigue, uncomfortable skin, persistent pruritus, appetite changes, nausea, general malaise. And because each one of those signs seems so common by itself, they get dragged along for weeks under the wrong label. That is what makes this case a true clinical puzzle. The same itch can point in completely different directions. One path leads to the skin, another to infestation, another to the liver and bile, another to the kidneys. And all of them can begin in exactly the same way, with someone trying to solve at home something that seems too small to be important. But in medicine, persistent symptoms are not measured only by intensity. They are measured by pattern, by duration, and by the company they keep. An itch that lasts for weeks and does not respond to basic measures already deserves respect. An itch that comes with yellowish eyes deserves even more. An itch that gets worse at night and starts appearing in other people in the house completely changes the weight of suspicion. And generalized itching without an evident lesion invites the investigation to move beyond the surface. In front of the mirror, none of that had a name yet. There was only the uncomfortable sense that the most ordinary symptom in that story might also be the most misleading one. And when a common symptom starts behaving in an uncommon way, that is where the real mystery begins. The most dangerous part of stories like this is that the body rarely warns in theatrical ways. There is almost never an emergency soundtrack. What usually exists is persistence. A symptom that lasts longer than it should. A sensation that no longer fits the initial explanation. A new detail that, on its own, might seem small, but once added to the rest, completely changes the direction of interpretation. That was what happened here. The itching was no longer just itching. It had gone on too long, hit too hard, followed too clear a pattern. And now it had company: slightly yellow eyes, darker urine, episodes of paler stools, fatigue that no longer felt like just routine. Suddenly, what had seemed like a surface problem was gaining depth. That is why the twist in this case is not a last-minute dramatic diagnosis. The twist is recognizing that the allergy may never have been an allergy at all. The skin was just telling the story the only way it could. In some liver and bile duct conditions, especially when cholestasis is present, bile does not flow the way it should, and the body begins sending signals that may include significant itching, jaundice, dark urine, and pale stools. When that cluster of clues appears, it no longer makes sense to keep treating the situation as if it were only dryness or a reaction to some product. But the strength of this mystery lies in the fact that the same complaint can arise through completely different mechanisms. If the strongest clue is timing, severe worsening at night, and if the symptom begins appearing in close contacts, then the reasoning must seriously consider scabies. That household detail is not secondary. It is central. When more than one person at home begins to itch, even if each one describes it differently, that stops looking like coincidence and starts functioning like contextual evidence. And as if that were not enough, there is still the silent kidney pathway. This is important because it reminds us that internal illness does not always look the way lay people expect it to look. Sometimes the body does not warn with flanked pain. Sometimes it warns with exhaustion, skin discomfort, persistent pruritus, appetite changes, nausea, or a gradual decline that nobody notices all at once. And because those signs are diffuse, they can be mislabeled for far too long. This is where the case reveals its real logic. The skin was not lying, it just was not the main author of the story. It was doing what it often does in medicine, serving as a display window for something happening somewhere else. Maybe the origin was dermatologic. Maybe infectious. Maybe systemic. But the greatest mistake would have been to keep looking only at the outside, as if an external symptom must always have started there. That is the kind of clinical trap that delays investigation. Because the patient keeps buying creams, changing soap, washing clothes with another detergent, trying to control the surface, while the whole body is already trying to warn that the explanation may be much deeper. And that is why the safe guidance in this case matters just as much as the mystery. Persistent itching lasting for weeks deserves medical evaluation, especially when it is generalized, does not improve with simple measures, or comes together with signs like yellowing of the eyes, darker urine, paler stools, weight loss, fever, extreme fatigue, or significant malaise. Jaundice, especially when it appears along with itching, dark urine, and pale stools, is a warning sign that should not be pushed aside for later. There are also signs that raise the level of concern even further: easy bleeding, confusion, excessive sleepiness, high fever, unexplained weight loss, or an overall worsening condition. These findings may point to more serious situations and justify seeking prompt medical attention. And, as with any condition that may involve an acute reaction, if itching is accompanied by shortness of breath, swelling of the face or tongue, a feeling of faintness, or rapid, intense illness, emergency care should not be delayed. At that point, this is no longer just about discomfort. It is about recognizing that the body may be signaling real danger. In the end, the real twist is not discovering that every itch hides something serious. It does not. Very often, the cause really is simple. The twist is understanding that persistent, intense, unusual itching, especially when it comes with associated clues, should not automatically be treated as trivial. Because sometimes a person thinks they are fighting a stubborn allergy when, in reality, they are facing a systemic warning sign asking to be taken seriously. The skin was itching, yes. But maybe it was only telling, on the outside, a story that had started much earlier, much deeper, in silence. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more diagnostic file mystery stories.